A Christchurch councillor has identified himself as the person at the centre of an investigation into misconduct allegations involving interactions with young people, but Councillor Deon Swiggs has denied any wrongdoing. The three complainants, aged between 13 and 21 at the time, say Mr Swiggs engaged in grossly inappropriate late-night messaging on social media on numerous occasions and insisted on hugs instead of handshakes. But in a statement this afternoon, Mr Swiggs denied the allegations, saying he welcomed a full investigation into the complaints and would fully cooperate with the inquiry. Conan Young spoke exclusively with the youngest complainant, whose voice we have altered to protect his identity.
The boy, who we'll call Josh, was only 13 when he says he first met Councillor Deon Swiggs at a youth event in July 2017. He offered to shake the councillor's hand, but was instead offered a hug.
At the end, right when I was being like, okay, bye, to go off to talk to other people, he was like, oh, okay, come in, and went in for a hug. I didn't want a hug from him. I hadn't even known who he was, and that whole entire time it was an incredibly uncomfortable experience for me, being a young person with someone who is much older and in a position of power.
Just over a year later, Josh says there was more physical contact that made him feel uncomfortable, again at an official function for young people that Mr Swiggs was attending in an official capacity.
So I went in for a handshake. He said, oh, I think we're past that. He then went in for quite a big hug. That was kind of not just your kind of typical kind of friend hug. It was very over the arms, going into quite a bear hug, which made me feel incredibly uncomfortable. Not a place or I wanted to be after that because of it, because it's kind of like, as a whole, just gross. It made me feel unsafe. It made me feel like this wasn't a place I could belong, because I was constantly having to worry about those types of things.
Josh says there was more unwanted touching by Mr Swiggs about 6 months later at a youth festival.
He wanted a selfie, and so I was like, okay, cool. He then went in to hold the, go around to my back and hold by my hip. He went and took numerous photos holding on in a very place that was uncomfortable for me for a long period of time, probably 8 to 10 seconds, which is quite a while when you think about it, taking a photo.
Then there was the pet name Councillor Swiggs had for Josh.
He introduced me to another elected member using that nickname as well. So the nickname, not using my name, was Baby, then insert name. That in itself is just so gross.
At the same time as all of this was going on, Josh says Deon Swiggs was exchanging late-night messages with him on Facebook. He says the only reason he was friends with the councillor on Facebook was because the much older man was a city councillor and somebody he felt he needed to maintain a professional relationship with. One of the first messages he received from him on Facebook was signed off with an X. But it was the one Josh received in May of this year that encouraged him to finally break his silence and tell somebody what had been happening.
Out of the blue at night, he messaged me saying, yo, where is your profile picture? Again, I saw that message, but I didn't want to have to reply. I felt uncomfortable at replying, especially at a late time of night. So I left that until the next day, where I then replied saying, oh, I just didn't like the one I currently had. I'm just waiting to take a new one. He then replied back and said, oh, but insert name, you're a very attractive young lad. No need to be so hard on yourself. Again, I saw that message. I wanted to avoid it. I didn't want to have to reply. It made me feel uncomfortable, gross, almost sick to some point with the power imbalance and kind of where he was standing in society and me as a young person.
At this point, Josh's case was taken to the mayor on his behalf by an advocate. A short time later, he told his father. At first, the advocate only disclosed the late-night message to the mayor. Leanne Dalzell says she agreed to speak to Mr Swiggs about appropriate behaviour and the power imbalance that exists between a councillor and a young person. She also says she banned him from events where he'd be in contact with young people. Ms Dalzell says she met with representatives for the young people again later in June and explained to them that the council's code of conduct process was extremely poor for dealing with such matters because it relied on a vote of the council, and even then the council could only make a recommendation. At this point she offered up the possibility of restorative justice. She then handed the matter on to the acting chief executive, Mary Richardson, to deal with. The council has now started a code of conduct process, starting with an independent investigator looking at whether a further investigation is warranted. Deon Swiggs has declined several interview requests, but in a statement this afternoon, he said it was important for him to identify himself to stop aspersions being cast on his council colleagues. He went on to say he denied any allegations of misconduct and he welcomes the investigation. Mr Swiggs said he would fully comply with the inquiry. Meanwhile, with voting closing in less than 3 weeks, Josh says it would be wrong to wait until after the local body elections for the public to be made aware of his claims.
The voters of Christchurch Central deserve to know the full truth about who they're voting for. I'm not going to go and say any views on it, but I'm here to say my story so that voters know that the person that they could be electing is not just as he seems, and that there are things behind that about how his actions and comments have made a minor feel.
It remains unclear how long the inquiry will take, but Mr Swiggs says he hopes it will be resolved quickly so Christchurch ratepayers have certainty ahead of the election. Kei o te tahi aho mō te hotaka o te ahi, ko Conan Young tēnei.